This is what happens when you have somebody who doesn't give a shit about victims of an actual tragedy. They care about pushing a narrative, and the narrative here is, of course, trans people bad. Okay, we gotta talk about something. You guys aren't gonna like the conversation we have to talk about, and we're not gonna be doing any fan art for this one because we are talking again about the Nashville shooting. So, remember when I said that we are going to see a lot of people who are weaponizing the fact that the Nashville shooter was trans in order to make the argument that transness is somehow correlative with the nature of being a mass shooter, the nature of being evil, the nature of being cruel. Like, there's a... They believe, at least conservatives believe, or want you to believe, that there's a causative link between being trans and doing something like the Nashville shooting. If you don't believe me at all, why is an influencer with 75,000 followers saying, never forget a trans person like Dylan Mulvaney killed these 6 people? Never forget a trans person like Dylan Mulvaney killed 6 people. So, guys, has anybody once, ever claimed that being trans necessarily means that you'll never do terrible things to people? Like, is there something about being trans that makes somebody a good person? No. There's just as many bad people that are trans as there are bad people that are cis. In terms of, relative scale, one has nothing to do with the other. However, we are seeing an uptick of people who are placing the weight on the transness. They are placing the weight on being trans. Let's ignore every single shooter that has ever existed that was cis or white or male. Let's ignore all of them. No, we must talk about the transness of a person. Tweets like this piss me off a little bit. And it's not just the tweet, it's the underlying principle. It's the fact that this is something that is going to be echoed for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to come. This is what happens when you have somebody who doesn't give a shit about victims of an actual tragedy. They care about pushing a narrative, and the narrative here is, of course, trans people bad. No, trans people exist. That's it. They just exist. Exist. That's it. That's all it is. And yet, of the 146 mass shootings that have happened so far in the United States, this one uniquely gets blamed on the transness of the individual. The individual here, for whatever reason they decide to engage in a mass shooting, is a monster because they engaged in this mass shooting. Now, I've seen some people in my comment section try to say that, like, oh, well, this person was obviously bullied, or this might have been a revenge case. And no, I don't care. You pick up the gun, you kill the people, you're the bad person. I don't give a flying shit past that, and nobody else should either. If the shooter turns out to be, again, the type of person you see in most mass shootings, which you would see because most people are cis, and in the United States, we have more white people than anybody else, straight people than anybody else. We gotta ask ourselves about how society is failing these poor people. But the minute that it's, a trans person, it's trans terrorism. It gets correlated with a trans day of vengeance that was in planning works several days, even weeks, before the actual event ever took place. In 2022, almost every single mass shooting, or mass killing, every extremist mass killing, was linked to the political far-right spectrum of influence, of punditry, of, well, existence. The ideological bent between family members and consumed content was almost always politically right-wing. This is not to say that all right-wingers are bad. It's not. But if we look at the amount of mass shootings that were performed in the last, let's say 5 years, we find there have been 2,826. I mean, at the very least, at time of this graph, mass shootings perpetuated by cis people. And then, of course, 3 perpetuated by, or perpetrated by, trans people. I don't know how better to describe the problem here. If there are only 1% of people in the United States, 1.6 million, that are trans, then we should see 1% of that almost 3,000 number be represented in trans mass shootings. There should be 30. There should be 30 mass shootings from trans people. Thereabouts. There's not. There's 3. Oh, but don't worry. You definitely should be panicking about those very, very bad trans people. Don't worry! They're definitely violent, and this is definitely part of a larger trend that we need to be giving a shit about for some reason. People like this tend to have a personality that is largely about just hating whatever thing conservative punditry wants them to hate at the time. Right now, it's trans people. At one point, it was gay people, and if we rewind the clock about 40 or 50 years, it would be black people. And yet, we find people who believe this bullshit. There are people right now who will listen to Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh, and yes, even this dipshit, Cassandra Wears Heels, who will listen to this, internalize the idea that somehow being trans is linked to terrible things happening to people all the time. And yet, when the data shows that they're wrong, people don't fucking listen. They don't. Because doing research into things, that's difficult. Learning about data and statistics and trends, that's difficult. Hell, I've ran into this myself when somebody made the claim in a previous video where they said that there's a higher they said that trans people join the United States military at a higher rate than cis people, and I disagreed immediately because I forgot that rate implies that we're talking about, per capita population stats, and then it turns out they were right. I've done this. Everybody does this when they hear something that sounds intuitively right or intuitively wrong. We have a mass shooter who's trans. You've been primed to be angry at trans people. You automatically think it's because they're trans. Protesters get violent at a BLM rally. You've been primed to believe that black people are somehow less than white people in some way, shape, or form. It's automatically because they're being uppity and they should just sit down and take things. Like, this is the kind of language that we see all the fucking time. And then, of course, from accounts that say things like this, we get things like, what's the difference between a parent affirming a child's desire to kill himself and a child's desire to mutilate himself? So, this is ignoring the fact that not all trans people ever get surgery, which is the mutilation you're talking about, right? Right? That one? We get, Cassandra here saying dumb things like, Joe Biden still hasn't visited East Palestine. And he still didn't visit Nashville either. You know why Joe Biden probably hasn't visited Nashville? You know why? Here. I'll show you the exact reason why. Because Joe Biden cannot be in 146 places. Joe Biden cannot be at every single mass shooting that happens. It is impossible. But these aren't things that will be considered by the types of people like Cassandra and by general conservative punditry. They'll ask why people like the president aren't visiting Louisville or Nashville. When it's a trans person who has pronouns, obviously they're bad and they're derailed and doing terrible things. But, let's ignore every other mass shooting that ever happens or the reasons that they happen. Again, this is the type of person. And the people who follow this and respond well to this are the types of people who are primed. Now, it should be important to note, largely, that a lot of these people are what I would call victims. I would call somebody who is listening to conservative punditry, agreeing with the shit they're saying, as back-asswards as it is, I would call them victims. Now, the minute that they decide to engage in harm, I would call them both victim and assailant, but largely I would call them victims. Because common sense, quote, quote, is usually what people are using for their knee-jerk reactions here, and that's what conservative punditry plays upon. It plays on your predispositions. It plays on whatever biases you've walked into that conversation with. When you hear that a minority does something, conservative punditry usually primes you to believe that it is the entire group, the entire minority group, to be blamed for that. There's a problem in black culture, and that's why gang violence. There's a problem in trans culture. That's why mass shooting. There's a problem in gay culture. That's why Pulse nightclub shooting. Because people have reasons to attack them. Didn't you see Pizzagate? It sounds insane and stupid. But the problem is that we hear it time and again in fragments, in stages. And whenever we try to say, hey, what happens when we turn that back on you? What happens when we turn it on cis straight white people? You know, me. What happens when we do that? They freak the fuck out and go, no, 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 that's stupid. You can't do that. That's identity politics. You fucking woke SJW. But when they do the exact same thing, they get shouted out by other conservative punditry. And then another lovely thing happens. People start justifying violence. After all, you want to save the kids, right? You want to save them from the people who would mutilate them. You want to save them from the people who would incite another shooting. You want to save the children, right? I do not remember where the exact tweet is from, because I tend to filter bullshit out of my brain as fast as I consume it. But there is a tweet out there from a conservative influencer that said that we need gulags again for trans people. We have people like Matt Walsh talking about the lengths he'll go to, quote, protect his kid. We have all kinds of absolutely brain-dead takes that come from this, and ignorant people eat it up. This is why I try to have a focus on education. This is why I try to have a focus on conversation. Because you can't change the mind of a Shapiro, of a Walsh, of Cassandra here. You can't change the mind of those people. Those people have a grift to run, and when they don't have a grift, they have money to make. The average Joe, they don't have the exact same problem. The average person is misled when it comes to trans issues, because it's so easy to mislead people when it comes to trans issues. This is even assuming that the Nashville shooter was even trans in the first place, but we're not going to get into that right now. All we're going to get into is the fact that if most of these people met a trans person in their life, and even worse, was attracted to that trans person, I guarantee you that we wouldn't be seeing the exact same style of reaction that we do now. There's a reason I made my video on why trans people are a target. You don't meet that many trans people out in the open, usually, especially in rural areas, because a lot of them are in the closet. A lot of them are where it is safer for them to exist. Or a lot of them just passed and you never fucking knew. And it makes them easy targets for punditry, especially when you bring kids into the mix. We're going to see a lot more of this. And it sucks, because of course, in Louisville, there was another mass shooting today, at time of recording. Shooter wasn't trans, but don't worry, there's definitely a trend here. There's definitely a trend here. It's definitely the transness. It's definitely that. Remember, trans people are definitely the most important thing in the entire world to be pissed off about, according to conservative punditry. Let's ignore the fact that over 100 laws have been written specifically about trans people and taking away their rights in the United States right now. Let's ignore the fact that in most United States, you can still use the trans panic defense in a court of law. Let's ignore the, actual realities of the world, of the legal system, and let's just play pretend that they're the boogeyman, and we need to get rid of the boogeyman. It's very important that we get rid of the boogeyman, whatever the boogeyman happens to be that week. But that said, as always, everybody, this is where I throw it to you. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Maybe the situation has ways that we can improve it. Who knows? But as always, everybody, insert end video tagline here.